We have a lot to cover today, so we'll get moving pretty quickly. I just want to thank ASBA for helping with a lot of the technical work on putting the PowerPoints and stuff together. Tracy Benson was a big help to us. With Janice and I this morning are Chris Thomas, or this afternoon. Chris Thomas is going to talk at the end of the webinar about some of the policies that ASBA will be working on in relation to changes in the legislation. And we also have Tim Ogle, who's the Executive Director for ASBA, with us today. And then, as usual, I want to thank EJ Nicely from Nicely Done for not embarrassing me by making me try to do the technical work, which wouldn't work, and everybody would be mad, and we'd fail. So we will start. Janice, do you have any opening remarks you'd want to make?
I just want to remind folks that the webinar will be recorded and available on both of our websites after.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. It's better than trying to record it beforehand.
And if I could just jump in, I think a special credit goes to Chuck and Janice for the great teamwork they demonstrated downtown this session. They are too shy to say it, but they were really effective at warding off some very dangerous legislation and really fit hand in glove in their work. So special appreciation to these two for their tireless work, believe me, late into the night, many nights. So thank you guys.
Well, thank you for those kind words. And this was a session where people really did well working together. The Education Finance Reform Group with Megan and Jeremy was very helpful on bills. Sabrina from ASA gave us a lot of support, and Janice and I worked with all of them, and Jennifer from AEA. So we had a good group of people, and this is the best session that I remember where people worked together and they would coordinate testimony and share in the workload. And I think, as Tim Ogle said, we were successful in especially stopping a lot of things that would have been very, very bad for schools. So we'll now go to our first slide, which is we're going to talk about the budget that the state adopted. And the first thing is the increase in the base level is 1.4%, and you can see it'd be $33,326.54, and increased from that number to what we have for this year, which is $3,373.11, which would be a 1.4% increase. The legislature, for the second year in a row, funded the annual inflation rate as prescribed by law, but remember, there's still a lawsuit going out there in terms of what the state will need to do with the inflation increase in prior years that was not funded. And the transportation is increased by 1.4%. District additional assistance, remember the legislature last year combined Coral and Soft Capital into one fund and called it District Additional Assistance. That fund still has the $238 million cut reduction that was there for the last few years, which is putting a real strain, as all of you know, on school districts, especially in the capital area, because the number was low to start with, and then that's a very significant cut. They did keep the provision in there for districts that have less than 1,100 students, and that is a typo. It should be $5 million. The cut is $5 million for those districts. That means their cut will be a little bit less. For most districts, a good way to estimate what you're going to get in district additional assistance next year is pretty much what you got this year. The numbers are all the same. It'll change a little bit because of some growth, but what you got this year is probably what you're going to get in fiscal year 15. And charter school with additional assistance also got a 1.4% increase, and that's increased every year, just as transportation has increased every year. And you can see that's $1,700 for an elementary and over $15 million, over $1,900 for a high school student. Next slide is district-sponsored charter schools. That was one of the major issues during this legislative session. Legislation went back and forth in terms of what was finally going to be put in place, and what the legislature finally ended up adopting and the governor approved is that no new district-sponsored charter schools are authorized. So if they're not already in operation, there's no opportunities for any new ones to come on board. For district-sponsored charter schools that began operation for this year, stated in the laws after June 30th, 2013, they can continue to operate for one more year and through fiscal year 15, and then they are no longer allowed to continue. The charter schools, that district-sponsored charter schools that were in operation on prior to June 30th, 2013, some of them have been in place for a number of years. They can continue to operate, but for fiscal year 15 and for all future years, the total count of the students that they have in district-sponsored charter schools for each of those districts cannot be more than 20% in total of what they had in fiscal year 2012-2013. So they're limited and basically limited in any future growth to no more than that 20% total. The other thing that's, and I think many of the district-sponsored charter schools that were in operation and are going to be allowed to continue for fiscal year 2015 as their last year, their limited additional funding for district-sponsored charter schools is $24.5 million, and that's less than what it would have cost the state to fully fund them. And the law requires a formula that the state Department of Education is to distribute that $24.5 million to those that group of district-sponsored charter schools based upon the count in their district-sponsored charter schools for this year. And I believe most of those districts have been notified by the Department of Ed what that estimated number is. And they did waive the law, which has been in the law for a number of years, that districts would have to repay any additional money they got for a district-sponsored charter school, and for the districts that have to convert back because of this law, they're limited. They don't have to make that payment back.
And I think, just reiterating, I think, Megan Dellartino and Sabrina Vasquez and us, this is a very good team effort, because this became one of the cornerstone issues near the end of the budget. And while I think we would all agree that this was not the optimal conclusion, it is a heck of a lot better than it would have been without that teamwork taking place, because we really started out with the fact of folks not wanting any funding or any continuation of district-sponsored charter schools. Would also draw attention to, this is the comprehensive look of what it means for district-sponsored charter schools, but for anyone that's looking for additional information, the various provisions are really contained in 3 different bills that you have to look together, between the Appropriations Speed Bill, the Higher Education Budget Reconciliation Act, as well as a trailer bill that we'll talk about a little bit later there. So feel confident that this is a comprehensive look, however, the language is contained in different areas.
And as Janice mentioned, this was a very major issue during the legislative session, and it swung all the way from zero. There was no additional money that would be available to those district-sponsored charter schools that started after June 30th, 2013, and then it went up to 50% of the $33 million, and then it finally at least ended up at $24.5 million. So it was a lot of good work by a lot of people, at least to allow it to continue and get the funding up from where it was originally set at. Next slide. Student Success Funding Formula. This is the governor's performance funding plan that was discussed last year and was adopted and passed by this legislative session and will take effect this year. One person that probably a lot of you have heard from on this issue was Dale Frost from the governor's office, who really spent a lot of time meeting with people, listening to people, and trying to make changes based upon that input. And the legislature didn't fund the whole $40 million that the governor wanted. They're funding it at $21.5 million. It will require, and the Auditor General will have to set up a separate fund for the deposit of those monies called the Student Success Fund. And our understanding is that the way the legislature was put together and the intent of the legislature is that districts would have full flexibility on how they spend that money, but they would spend it out of the Student Success Fund. It'll most likely, I think it will be a cash-controlled fund. So districts will only be able to spend the money once they receive the cash from the state, similar to probably how Indian gaming is a cash-controlled fund. The The districts will be required to report how they spent their money and what they did in that program on by October 15, 2015. The Department of Ed is going to be required to post information on their website based upon what was reported. And if districts want, and I think a number of you have already looked, if the governor's website has a report on that website which shows how much money a district would have received and a charter school would have received this year had the funding program been in place. Next year, which would be fiscal year 15, things will change and be adjusting, but at least it gives you some idea of what the amount per pupil would have been based upon prior year data. And when you're going to that website, it's important, since that website amount per pupil is based upon the full $40 million, to adjust it, because there's only 54% of the total money that's available because of the reduction that the legislature made in the governor's request.
So some other state funding that was in the budget is an additional $8 million for the new assessment for Arizona's college and career ready standards. Keep in mind that the department already receives $10 million, so the total appropriation is $18 million. At least in initial discussions, it looks like this will not be enough to adequately cover the entire cost. However, the department seems confident that they may have some additional resources and/or a need for a supplemental. As kind of a sidebar, the State Board of Education is still working on the request for proposal for the assessment. It will likely be out in the next couple of weeks. At least for the initial request for information, there were 6 providers or 6 vendors that expressed interest. However, you can imagine the costs were not necessarily appropriated on there because of the competitive nature of that and because it wasn't an actual request for proposal. So we will see what those costs are, but that should be coming out in the next couple of weeks, and the department does have that $18 million. There's also $1 million for IT certification programs, and then a total of $250,000 for a K-6 language intervention program. It's a 2-year pilot program, $200,000 of which is new monies, $50,000 which is a repurposed appropriation, and the State Board will begin work on that about what the pilot will look like and how schools will be selected.
Next one is joint JTEDs, Joint Technical Education Districts. There's $500,000 provided for performance funding. I believe the concept behind that was on the school success formula, and the governor's formula program doesn't really work because of the testing and the measurements that are used for traditional districts. So this is kind of something for JTEDs. The $1 million for soft capital and equipment funding for small JTEDs was vetoed by the governor, but we just wanted to remind everybody that that was in there, and also to make people aware that that did not make it because of the governor's line item veto. And then changes in the funding formula for large JTEDs. Last year, the legislature moved the small JTEDs to 100% of their calculated funding, where they had been at 91%, and this year they moved the large JTEDs, which are JTEDs with more than 2,000 students, from 91% to next year they'll be funded at 95.5% of their calculated amount. Next is the Committee to Study Broadband Expansion. This came out, I think, as a response to the original proposal that was put out by the governor and the governor's staff of a $15 per student fee, which got no support from anyone along the way. Both charters and districts opposed it. Districts had some issues with it because it was unfair to the districts who would have already spent money on expanding their program, and just a lot of problems with it, and it never really got any serious thought. But what this program would do is to establish a committee to study broadband expansion. There's a 15-member committee that's composed of 6 legislators, 9 representatives from schools, state government, internet service providers, and a parent of a child enrolled in a free and reduced lunch program in a school district or charter. There was a piece of legislation that came out through after this that the governor vetoed, which would have changed the composition of that committee a little bit and would have had it expand to 17 members and would have added extra internet provider representation. So this goes back to the original language that was passed by the legislature, and that committee will start, and they'll do a preliminary report in December of 2014 and the final report by 2015, and the committee is co-chaired. Co-chairs are selected by the Speaker of the House and the President of the Senate from their membership. Very important committee and a very important assignment. I know EJ nicely is with us today, and his dad have been spending time talking to people because we really need to do something to expand the connections in this state, and hopefully this committee can come up with a good plan and a good way of doing that.
And I would just add, we've had a number of questions about what this committee would do, and it really is specific to broadband expansion, making sure that there is service and connectivity throughout the state. Unfortunately, at least the charge at this moment in time is not looking at the hardware as it relates to the assessment or any of the other technology infrastructure needs that are associated. This truly is a broadband expansion, and as Chuck mentioned, Ernie and others have been a part of a lot of conversations, and the hope is that by creating this committee, it will help leverage some continuity as well as some federal funds to hopefully ensure that it's not going to be school districts or others that are going to have to pick up the tab, but that we can really leverage additional resources so we get that connectivity without undermining some of the current dollars that we have.
Yeah, and before the meeting today, Ernie was talking to us about some of the issues, and the feeling is that in Arizona, the cost of broadband connections are a lot more expensive than they are in other states. It may be more, according to Ernie, more than double. And hopefully this committee could find some way of maybe increasing competition or whatever they would do to bring the cost, because there's two issues. The cost is certainly a big issue, and then just having the connections available. And maybe this committee working together can come up with some good solutions.
So now we're going to move into some of the legislation that has passed. And the general effective date for all the legislation that we'll talk about is July 24, 2014, unless there is an emergency clause or unless there's some retroactivity clause that's included in there. And a couple of items before we start getting into the meat of this is that first, we forgot a big thank you. We're talking about how well folks have worked together in the lobbying community, and that is absolutely true. But our efforts are not in a vacuum, and it's the help of legislative staff from both parties as well as the research staff that has been very, very helpful in ensuring that we get some quality legislation as well as assistance on the positive and negatives happen. So there's a big thank you. I thought legislative staff was excellent this year and very, very helpful. The other is a big thank you to all of you, because our advocacy efforts are the reason that you won't see a robust negative listing of bills. Our advocacy efforts were very much heightened this year. Jeff Esposito in ASBA's shop did a great, great job, continues to do so, and it's really your efforts that have helped us be effective on that. Having said that as well, we will have the comprehensive legislative brief that will encompass all of the past legislation, the vetoed legislation, the failed legislation, those that got lost in the process, and those that never had a hearing, because today we're only going to talk about those passed and those vetoed. But that will be available May 14th, so take a look for that, and that will, like I said, have a comprehensive listing of all of those items. So bills that have passed, another caveat that we have, and we will try to say it for each bill, is that there are still pieces of legislation that have passed the legislature that are sitting on the governor's desk waiting for action, because she does have 10 days after sine die to take action. Some bills have been chaptered, some we're still waiting for. So like I said, we'll try to identify those as we go through each of the bills. And so Chuck will start off with 2039.
Okay, 2039, charter schools, higher education sponsors, universities, community college districts, and a group of community college districts are allowed to sponsor charter schools, and this was to allow the employees of all of those schools to participate in the state retirement system as all other charter schools are permissive in terms they want to be part of the state retirement system. So it opened that opportunity to those three groups. Just as an aside, and I know some of the school attorneys have been taking a look at what happens with universities, community college districts, and similar. A good example would be in the Phoenix Elementary District. The ASU has a charter school that's using one of the ASU facilities, and how might that work with some school districts in the future? But anyway, this just makes all those employees, if they weren't eligible to belong to the state retirement system before, they would be eligible. Next one.
Next bill, House Bill 2139 was signed by the governor but has yet to be chaptered, and this is the one piece of expansion empowerment scholarship account legislation that was passed this year. This is the smaller one of the various items. We are still unfortunate to see it, but it did pass and did get signed by the governor to expand eligibility to a sibling of a current or previous empowerment scholarship account recipient, as well as those eligible to enroll in or preschool children with disabilities that are eligible to enroll in a program. That we do not have estimates yet of the number of additional ESA students that this would encompass, but keep in mind, because it's now a sibling of a current or previous ESA, it's a way for them to bypass some of the requirements, either to be special education or be in a D or F school or be a child of a military personnel. Those all get bypassed if you are a sibling of that. So we think that this could at least have a 50% increase into ESA scholarship recipients. Next bill is House Bill 2150. Currently, children of military personnel or those killed in the line of duty are eligible for ESAs. The change that House Bill 2150 that was signed by the governor does is it removes that 100-day requirement to have been previously enrolled in a public school. So in essence, takes away the switcher issue because, and the rationale behind that is because military kids tend to move more frequently and may not be able to accomplish that requirement. At least for initial conversations, they think 4 children would be encompassed within this legislation.
As Janice talked earlier, because of a lot of good support from people contacting their legislators, there was a couple of moves in the legislature to vastly increase the empowerment scholarships to include everybody who was on free and reduced lunch, Chapter 1 schools, increasing it to where probably the majority of kids in the state would be eligible. But because of people working together, people contacting the legislators, they were able, those never passed. But there was attempts to really expand it drastically.
House Bill 2265, computer science courses, math credit. This is another one that has been signed by the governor but yet to be chaptered. Allows district school boards as well as charter boards operating as a high school to approve computer science courses to fulfill the math core competency requirements as long as they are prescribed by the State Board of Education. So this is kind of marrying the local control as well as the State Board of Education's requirement for rigorous math courses, yet providing the flexibility that we've already started to see through career and technical education courses as well as computer science. So the computer science course must include significant math content. Again, that's going to be fleshed out by the State Board of Education and directs the governing body of that school to determine whether there's sufficient capacity prior to approving the course. But again, this is kind of an effort for, as we've increased the math core competencies for graduation, also honoring the fact that those core competencies can be accomplished through career and tech as well as some of the higher computer science courses. Okay, House Bill 2306, fingerprint clearance cards, periodic checks. It adds the trafficking of persons for forced labor or services to the list of offenses, but more specifically and important for school districts, and actually this just came up at a council of school attorneys meeting, is the fact that it now requires, rather than it being voluntary, Department of Public Safety's fingerprinting division to conduct periodic state criminal history checks. And so those need to be updated so that we know if a certificated employee of ours does obviously was required to have that fingerprint clearance card, but that now these will be updated to ensure that no offense has been conducted during that point in time, and if it has, then the districts will be informed of that. And so hopefully we have heard from some of the school district folks that this has not been, the Department of Public Safety has not been doing this this updating, so hopefully this will alleviate some of the issues that have been happening within our districts where offenses have been committed and we were not informed of those. And that has been chaptered, signed into law. Next bill is House Bill 2328. This has yet to have action by the governor, and of all of the ones that we'll talk about, this is one that I would still put a question mark whether this will be signed or not based on the governor's actions on another bill. But what it does is it removes the requirements for a qualified student to be eligible for a student tuition organization tax credit. So keep in mind that this is not the empowerment scholarship accounts that's in essence the voucher program. This is the student tuition organizations where a corporation is provided a dollar-for-dollar income tax credit on their tax liability in order to fund scholarships for kids in these student tuition organizations or kind of private entities. So it removes the requirement that a qualified student must have attended a qualified school previously, must have been a switcher, must have been in public school at least 90 days, been a kindergartner, or is a member of the military, and just says that a qualified student is someone that has previously qualified under the statute. While we still do not support this bill, there was an important amendment that really hats off to Sabrina and Mark Barnes with ASA in closing a loophole, because right now under current statute, even if a child receives $50 as a scholarship from the student tuition organization, they would then be allowed automatically to qualify for the empowerment scholarship account. So kind of a really huge loophole where these kids can then qualify for an empowerment scholarship account and really drain, you know, hundreds of thousands of dollars from the general fund if that was not closed up. So that second to last bullet is the loophole closer, where you're not allowed to be in an ESA unless you actually were in school that 90-day previous. And this one does have a retroactivity clause of June 30th, 2014. Like I said, the governor has yet to take action on that, and I would say don't count on that one being signed.
Okay, next bill is House Bill 2362. And I should have mentioned in the beginning that we hope to have a little time at the end for questions. And during the presentation, you certainly can type your questions in, and we'll try and get to address them at the end after Chris finishes talking about some of the school policies. This one was popular with a number of transportation directors because it kind of simplifies the system a little bit. Before, the Department of Administration and the Department of Public Safety had to work together on rules and regulations for pupil transportation, and now it's basically taken the oversight responsibility from the Department of Administration out of there and leaves it with the Department of Public Safety, which is the group that took most of the responsibility anyway. And as Janice said, that's Chapter 59, so it's been passed and signed by the governor. Next one is 2395, and this was an issue that was worked really hard by the county school superintendents. It was an Arizona Tax Research Association piece of legislation, and in the beginning had a lot of things in it that would have made it very difficult for the tax rates to be set when the county school superintendents had to submit information. It would have been way too early for that information to be available, and it finally did pass, and basically it requires the county school superintendents by July 25th to submit tax information to the Property Tax Oversight Commission. The Property Tax Oversight Commission is to review that information, and it modifies a few other school district property tax reports, but the main thing is now they have a more reasonable timeline that the county school superintendents got. And at one time, the law was written such that the Property Tax Oversight Commission would actually change the rate if they wanted to change it. And now that responsibility still remains with the county school superintendents, yet it is reviewed by the Property Tax Oversight Commission. Next bill is House Bill 2438. The legislature is not allowed to do legislation that would mention a particular school district, but most everyone realized that this was designed for the Clifton School District and Morenci. But then the way they do that in the legislature, you can see if you have less than 100 students for the past 3 years, a county with less than 15,000 people and everything, but basically allows the Clifton School District and other district that might qualify to have an election to basically convert their district to a transportation district under certain parameters, and I believe the students from Clifton would end up going to the Morenci School District, which is very close by, but it's legislation that would allow Clifton to have an election to become a transportation district.
Next bill is House Bill 2501, promotion ceremony, 8th grade. This was signed by the governor, and this removes the requirement that county school superintendents sign and furnish 8th grade promotion certificates if a school district asks that county superintendent to do so. The real impetus behind this was that, especially in some low-income areas where we're really trying to heighten, we're trying to heighten the expectations of all kids, but especially some low-income and low-performing areas that folks were looking at that 8th grade promotion certificate as almost a high school graduation diploma. And if we want to raise expectations, we need to raise that all the way around. And so by having that document, folks were thinking they were done with school rather than knowing that even a high school diploma, that there's some kind of post-secondary, whether it's career or college, is necessary. So it removes the requirement of the actual promotion certificate, but then the law makes clear that districts can still hold promotion ceremonies if they so choose. And like I said, that was signed by the governor. House Bill 2605, Teacher Suicide Prevention Continuing Education, requires the State Board of Education to allow suicide awareness and prevention to count as continuing education credits as it relates to educators, and has a retroactivity clause to July 1st of this year. And this, Representative Carter was very good of ensuring that this didn't become an additional mandate, rather that it gets embedded within some of the certification and continuing education requirements of our personnel. House Bill 2637, ADE Program Administration, and I'm sorry, 2605 the governor has signed, and then House Bill 2637, ADE Program Administration, it establishes the Department of Education Professional Development Revolving Fund. That's really more of a technical issue because they currently take some monies out of a fund that's more robust. So this is kind of differentiating what some of the monies in their kind of other fund are used for. But one of, or two of the issues that are important, I think, of specific importance is the third bullet, which now opens up the school safety program. So this is the program where school resource officers are additionally funded by the state. This now opens it up to charter schools rather than just school districts. And keep in mind that there was that additional $8 million funded last year for school safety, a small portion of which, about what, $250,000 is going to the pilot program. But the other item is that this contains the flexibility to the department as it relates to move on when reading. And so it prohibits students from being retained for failing to read at the third grade level if data regarding that student's performance on the AIMS test is not available. And this is really addressing the issue of the transition from AIMS to whatever assessment we use for Arizona's College and Career Ready standards. So it requires that students whose test data is unavailable to basically still receive those intervention strategies, but they will not be held back for that third grade year, and allows the State Board of Education to have alternative requirements or alternative standards for falling far below if we don't have an assessment in place by that time. And that does contain a retroactivity clause to July 1st, 2014 to ensure that there is no gap for those third graders that this may apply to. So those are a couple of significant items that are included in there. This is also the place where the 20% cleanup language for district-sponsored charter schools is held. So we talked about that a little bit earlier, but specifically this was part of the trailer legislation to make sure that it was clear what that 20% growth for district-sponsored charter schools applied to, which is those previous to, that were established previous to fiscal year 14.
Okay, Senate Bill 1102, this is an example of a bill where we won the battle and lost the war. It started out in the Senate with these additional reporting requirements that are now part of 1102, and we were able to convince legislators that the only thing that districts should have to report to the SFB in this kind of detail are when they're applying for money. And that's the way the bill came out of the Senate, but it got amended in the House and put back those reporting requirements where districts will now be required to report to the SFB major repairs, renovations, and replacement of building systems. The districts have to report when schools that they've closed, schools that have been leased, and schools that are operating as a charter school, and requires the SFB to adjust the age of buildings based upon major upgrades. The reason we lost the war is the governor and the governor's staff intervened and said this is something that the SFB needed, and she was more convincing than we were, or she had more leverage over them than we did. But it did go back. Now, how much districts will have to submit, the SFB, I assume, will have to put some forms together, and districts will do the best they can to get that kind of information to the SFB. All districts have to pay, and this was really already an understanding that districts must pay for the conversion of space and maintenance of administrative space. And the last item there, you probably look at, allows for floor bedding instead of cribs for some child care facilities. What does that have to do with the School Facilities Board? That's a very good question. There's a provision in the legislature that amendments have to be germane, and somehow they were able to convince the lawyers over there that that is germane and has some connection to the School Facilities Board, and that but really had nothing to do with schools. It was for child care centers that don't have kids in cribs. I think it's Montessori programs, and just has them on bedding on the floor. But now that did go through, and that is part of that bill. That's Senate Bill 1102.
Next bill, Senate Bill 1123, property liability, schools, recreational users. This is a follow-up from last year. If you remember last year, there was additional liability protection provided to school districts if they so chose to open up school facilities for use after hours. You know, this is very much for kids that do not have parks or do not have backyards readily available. This is an effort to try to get kids out playing to deal with some of the obesity issues. This was brought forward by the American Heart Association, and they did work with schools on this to broaden that liability protection for school districts by modifying the recreational user definition to eliminate the to and from school. So basically this is to allow for walking school buses. Specifically, this was an issue in Santa Cruz Valley where this was one of the provisions that schools were trying to help get kids active, but want to make sure that they had the liability protection available to them.
I have a confession to make on this. Janice and I worked on different slides, and I came to Janice and said, you have a typo. There are no such things as walking school buses. And she corrected me and showed me that I was wrong. And there are walking school buses, and now I'm smarter than I was before that. Next bill, 1182, school district overrides and bonds and information. There was a lot of proposed legislation this session that would just would have made it a lot more difficult. Still going to be difficult, but it would have been a lot more difficult to pass bond and override elections. There was one piece of legislation that you could only have elections in even years. And when we talk to people, I don't know how that works when you have overrides that are good for 5 years and phase out in 2 years. Having them in even years doesn't work. But anyway, a lot of that was stopped. And this bill got better than than part of the way it was phrased originally. it started out within the purpose statement, you couldn't say anything. You could just maybe say the dollar amount and put no other statements in the purpose statement. And it was amended, and basically you're allowed to provide informational and factual information in a neutral manner in the purpose statement for the bond and for the override. But any advocacy that you're making on behalf of those expenditures has to go into the arguments for and against the override. But at least now it's a lot more workable than it was, and that's 1182.
Senate Bill 1237. This is ADE's Empowerment Scholarship Account, kind of cleanup / technical / accountability bill as it relates to empowerment scholarships accounts. As you know, there has been oodles of media coverage on this, all the way from how the department was funding ESA kids to how much is remaining in various student bank accounts, all the way to whether, in fact, these are even being audited for some of the fraud protections that we enacted last year. And so all of that is relevant, and some of it is attempted to be cleaned up here. Specifically, that it's replacing the requirement that the department provide a copy of each contract of an empowerment scholarship account student to the county school superintendent with simply a list of those kids. You know, based in our initial conversations, I don't even think that those contracts were, a copy of those contracts was being provided, but this way, this list is supposed to be a way for folks for the county school superintendents to double check that in fact those kids are not enrolled in a public school, but in fact are on an ESA. But a couple of items that I think will be beneficial to schools is that right now, if a child or if a parent of a child with special needs applies for an empowerment scholarship account, it requires school districts now to determine what educational therapies or services that child should receive. So in essence, we school districts are having to pay for the assessment of a special needs child and creating that plan for them. However, then we don't get reimbursed for that, and then that parent takes their child into an empowerment scholarship account. Now it allows for either the school district to do that or an independent third party. So that should alleviate at least some costs to districts by having those independent third parties do that, and knowing that the school district is not on the hook for being the only provider of that. It also requires, there's a loophole currently in the law that one of the provisions that empowerment scholarship account students can do is therapies and tutoring services that are provided by an accredited entity. However, then there's another section of law that says you don't have to do that. Well, this would require that there does have to be some accreditation for those tutoring services. It just can't be the neighbor down the street that you're providing it. And last, and this goes to some of the information that's been provided about parents bankrolling some of these dollars into these funds where they have $50,000 plus in these accounts. It does require the parent to at least quarterly make expenditures out of those accounts, which currently is not part of the law. So we think those are some of this is on the governor's desk. She has yet to take action, but we think these are some positive aspects, at least to try and get our arms wrapped around what this ESA program actually looks like. One sidebar on it, this bill became the cornerstone of the debate between how we fund ESA students, because there is a disagreement between the education community and the Department of Ed and the ESA advocates of how that happens. None of that was included. The current language as of last year is included, which we believe is wherever you came from is what you will receive 90% of. So if you came from a charter school, this next year you will receive 90% of what charter school kids receive. If you come from a district school, you'll receive 90% of what you would have received at a district school. And that is at least the intention that we are operating under into this next school year. Senate Bill 1242, Critical Languages Economic Development Pilot Program, requires the State Board of Education, if sufficient funding is provided, to create a 6-year critical language and economic development pilot program. There was no funding provided for this program, so if there's no outside or private funding or any subsequent state appropriation, this will not take effect. However, you can see some of the various items that would be required if money is provided. But at this point and at the state board meeting on Monday, it was talked about, but without funding, they don't plan to move forward. Senate Bill 1288 would add academic performance and academic gain on the science portion of the AIMS test to be included in the A through F achievement profiles. Keep in mind that this law, this is on the governor's desk, has not had action taken, but if this law does take effect, this would have the general effective date of July 24th. So the thinking would be this would be applicable into fiscal year 15. And how that would happen would have to be determined by the State Board of Ed. Senate Bill 1314 started out as the Barber bill, but as of this was one of the final bills in session before we adjourned, and it became the continuation omnibus. So there's a number of state regulatory agencies that are included. The one just for us to take note of is that the State Board for Charter Schools has been reauthorized for another 10 years.
Okay, next bill is Senate Bill 1336. I believe this was initiated and supported by the Arizona Heart Association because they want to encourage school districts to allow their playgrounds and their fields to be used to make people exercise more and be healthy. And basically it provides immunity from civil liability to school districts, district employees, and governing board members, and does the same thing for charter schools. Basically, it grants immunity from civil liability for decisions made and actions taken to allow the use of school property except in cases of gross negligence or intentional misconduct. And I assume, Chris, that's a more tougher standard for somebody who's suing?
Yes, absolutely.
So this would encourage you to have some protection and hopefully open up more of your grounds and fields for people to use. ADE school finance revisions basically requires school districts to, which I think many districts already do, to provide fee waivers for children who are not able to, because of economic hardship, afford those fees. Teacher Experience Index moves the date up for the state to give preliminary notice to districts to February 1 rather than March 15th. Excuse me, a big thing for school districts in a couple of places in the state is the item about route miles. And what it was, there were some places in the state where accommodation school students were riding district buses to and from school, and this would prohibit both from counting those miles and allows supplemental state aid for natural disasters. Came about a little bit because of the Yarnell fire, and directs ADE to recompute ADM if they are going to do it for a previous year by August 30th and notify districts by September 15th of what those changes are, and increases flexibility in some of the Grand Canyon diploma provisions to make it a little more easy for students to benefit from that program.
All right, and you'll see this is the last bill that affects K-12 education that was passed this year is Senate Bill 1391. And this one have also a good appreciation for the Charter Schools Association. Jacob Prosey was very helpful in this and working together on making this from an original mandate to voluntary. So it allows charter schools to require all personnel to obtain a fingerprint clearance card. This is that higher level of background check and ongoing check for any kind of offenses rather than the one moment in time check that we provide for non-certificated personnel. But it does authorize now school districts, if they so choose, to require non-certificated and unpaid personnel to obtain a fingerprint clearance card. Again, this is voluntary. If the school district wants to do it, they can. And it also allows non-certificated and unpaid personnel who provide services to students without supervision to receive a fingerprint clearance card. And you know, I don't have to tell any of you out there of the cost differential between, about $25 with the background check that we currently provide to a fingerprint clearance card, which runs about, $60, $65, but it is good for 6 years. And now with that previous legislation we talked about earlier with the ongoing checks, it is a higher level of scrutiny. However, you have to weigh that against the expenses as well as the amount of time that folks are on campus with not having any kind of contact with kids. So, and it also allows the school district to communicate to another school district if that person has been issued or denied a fingerprint clearance card if they're requested to do so. So then to two veto bills by the governor. One was mentioned by Chuck, House Bill 2316, Schools, Local Control, Student Privacy. I'll start with what Chuck talked about. This would have made changes to the composition and the charge of the Joint Committee on Broadband Expansion and Education Technology by putting more providers on as well as an expert in E-rate. That did not take place. It also broadened the charge to, I would say, make it a little more school district centric about how we provide resources into this, into the final recommendations. Like I said, this was vetoed. Less about that issue and more about the underlying bill, which would have provided the Department of Education, the State Board of Education, and the Superintendent of Public Instruction, would have prohibited them from adopting federally mandated educational standards, curricula, or instructional approaches. And what the governor's veto letter articulated is, first of all, very similar to what most of the education groups said, is that this is redundant and unnecessary, considering that we don't have federal standards, we don't have a federal assessment, we have state standards and state assessments that may be coordinated nationwide, but not mandated from the federal government. So it's not necessary, but also concerns that this may have preempted ADE from requiring schools to do certain items like early reading with phonics, as well as the structured English immersion program. So that was vetoed by the governor. The second bill that was vetoed by the governor is Senate Bill 1048, which is interesting because this bill was also vetoed by the governor last year, and it would have kept the current cap on corporate student tuition organization tax credits, which right now is a little over $20 million, but it's allowed to increase by 20% every year. And what the governor was concerned about is with even just the current participants, it is likely that the general fund liability, just as it relates to student tuition organization tax credits for the corporate sector, would go all the way up to $100 million by fiscal year 2020. And so she did not want to expand to S corporations to have the ability to provide that student organization tax credit to reduce their income tax liability. So just to be clear again, it wouldn't have increased the amount of, it would not have increased the limit to the student tuition organization corporate tax credit, but by adding the number of corporations that would be eligible, it would increase the liability to the general fund in a more expeditious manner. So the governor did veto that for it, and that's why I would also say that, keep in mind 2328 may fall to the same fate if her reasoning stays consistent.
Okay, now we're going to talk about the Classroom Site Fund. I've gotten some calls, and Janice and I talked a little bit about districts were wondering why the Classroom Site Fund per pupil amount actually went down in the estimate for next year when the economy has recovered. And we thought we would just kind of cover that a little bit. And also for some of the people who are new to school finance to understand what happened with the Classroom Site Fund. And first, prior to fiscal year 2011, you can see starting in fiscal year 2002, the first year the monies were distributed, what the state would do is estimate what the budget capacity, what districts were supposed to receive in the next year. They do that estimate in March, and then districts are allowed to spend to that number, and everyone originally thought there'd be some kind of adjustments if they were if they overestimated, but there was nothing in the law that required the Joint Legislative Budget Committee to adjust their estimates. So you can see what happened in fiscal year 2006. They overestimated by $32, in fiscal year 2009 by $130, and in fiscal year 2010 by another $34. Basically almost $200 in terms of what districts were allowed to spend if they wanted to do so, in addition to the revenue that they were receiving. So the legislature, and a lot of credit on this goes to Rich Crandall, who worked with schools to get this change. And we'll show you what happened in the next slide, which is for fiscal year 2011 through 2015, what Rich's legislation and the legislature's legislation did is for fiscal year 11 and fiscal year 12, make the amount distributed $120, so that both of those years would be, the extra money actually collected would be used to offset that prior year deficit to bring districts back to even. If the state had not done that, in fiscal year 2011, the classroom site fund would have been pretty much zero, so nobody would have gotten any of it. At least this cushioned the blow a little bit. And you can see it's gotten now back to normal, and for fiscal year 14, the estimate's $310. The current year we are in, for next year it's $295. Now Janice will share a little bit with you about some of the reasons why the actual amount per pupil went down, even though the economy was doing better.
And back when Proposition 301 was passed in 2000, a lot of conversation was had about this next aspect, but we tend to forget about it now, in that various items come off the top. The classroom site fund is actually the very last bucket, if you will, as it relates to Prop 301. So it's kind of a cascading effect, where the first thing, and one of the first reasonings on the next slide, is one of the first reasons behind Proposition 301 was was coming off Roosevelt versus Bishop, and the need to get all school facilities up to standard. And so there were revenue bonds that were put out, and there was debt service that needed to be paid. And so the first thing that comes off the top is the School Facilities Board debt service. Universities, community colleges, and tribal educational entities receive a portion of that money as well, and you can see those stay pretty much consistent. This was also the place that we received the funding when we increased the number of school days in the year from 175 to 180. That is getting paid out of Proposition 301. It does come off the top, and as a sidebar, I think that's one thing, when Proposition 301 is set to sunset in 2021, we've changed the statutory provisions to require the 180 days. But the funding aspect of those 5 is still coming from here, so that's just something to keep in the back of your head. School safety has remained. School safety, failing schools tutoring funds, SAFE, all the accountability measures have stayed consistent at $16 million. And then there was also a $25 million income tax reduction for low-income persons to try to alleviate the regressivity of sales tax. And so when you see that, because that comes off the top, when times are good, we will start seeing more monies flow into the classroom site fund for distribution. But when times retract, as we saw during 2009, 2010, this money comes right off, leaving less money to flow down to the school, into the classroom site fund. So you can see in the next slide on fiscal year 2014, 2015, the sales tax has in fact grown, not by leaps and bounds, but it has grown since last year. So then you take that sales tax less the previous slide of the $277 million that goes for debt service, for the additional school days, for universities, community colleges, and you'll see this is what's left for the classroom site fund. So the 2 big issues of why we're seeing monies go down on a per pupil basis in fiscal year 15 is the fact that we have less prior year carry forward, as Chuck talked about. That's been kind of mitigated over the past few years with the changes. So we don't have as much carry forward, and our endowment earnings from trust lands have stayed relatively the same. And the endowment earnings, just to keep in mind, any of the interest we earn off the sales of state trust lands goes into that, as well as any commercial and agricultural leases go straight to this. So that's an extra $38 per kid that we receive. And you can see, so the real differential is the money coming off the top, as well as less prior year carry forward in the amount of weighted student count that we're receiving per kid.
And there's also be the impact of the weighted student count, because that went up, and that means you're distributing the money among a larger population. But it basically, when you look at sales tax was up to 620, or the estimate is for 628 million versus the 596. But because of the issues that Janice just talked about, it's not showing up in the actual per student amount per weighted student. And then the next slide, just wanted to remind people that it is a budget, the Classroom Site Fund is a budget controlled fund. And since the change has been made to the legislation that they'll make up for deficits and adjust amounts in future years or whatever, it's important for when you're doing next year and all future years is that if you have unexpended budget balance from the prior year, you carry that over as well as the net interest earned, if there is any in your district, to actually come up with the budget limit that you're allowed to have for future years. And then we have one last slide before we open it up to questions. We get calls, and I know Chris talks a number of times about how Arizona's changed over time. And what we've done here is put together a chart that shows per pupil K-12 system finance amounts. When we get the new numbers in for this year, we'll have a full 20 years to take a look at. And what we're doing here is a lot of times what legislators will say is when you just look at operating monies, which is a lot of times where the rankings are done, well, the districts have more money than that. And basically the dollar amount that we're showing here is all revenue, state, federal, and local revenues that districts have. And in 1991-92, Arizona, according to the federal report, had $4,900, and we ranked 34th, and we were at 87.7% of the national average. And you can see how we've constantly moved in the direction that many people would feel is the wrong direction. We went to 40th, we went to 42nd, we went to 45th, and for 2010-2011, we were at 47. And we were at $8,800 compared to the U.S. average of $12,411. We're down to almost 70%. If we were to move back, which probably is not going to happen, but if we were able to, or just to show the impact, if we continued to be at 87% in 2010-2011, that would require an additional $2 billion in school expenditures, just over $2,000 per kid, just to get us back to where we not even get us to the national average, but just get us back to 87.7% where we were in 91, 92. So it's not been good times over the years for school districts, and I don't have to tell, we don't have to tell you because you feel the day-to-day impact of that. But and then again, this is all revenue, state, local, capital, operational expenses, not a pretty picture. So now we will, going to turn it over to Chris. I almost forgot, Chris. Because you were quiet and didn't make fun of me, so I don't think you were in the room.
Thanks, Chuck.
You're welcome.
Well, and I would say a hopeful note before I say what I have to say is that I'm glad that Chuck put this together, but I would also say that just because things have steadily gone down doesn't mean it can't go the other way. We just need to do as good a job as we can as making our case. I'm going to talk a little bit, just really quick, and I appreciate Janice and Chuck giving me this time, just to mention policy changes that will be occurring both because of this session and because other things that are happening changes. But first, I would say, Janice and Chuck talked in the beginning about what a successful session this was in terms of collaboration amongst the education groups and the lobbyists, and it's really seen in the product. If you've been watching the bills that have been passed, there's not a lot of legislation that we're going to have to write policy for. And I chalk that out to a great victory, and not because I don't want to write policy, but because our charge is to try to get you as much money as you can and to try to allow you to be free to make decisions at the local level. And less legislation that requires less policy allows you to do more of that. So that's a really good thing. Also, I would say, and also looking at the legislation that was discussed, look at what the legislation that was passed, what it does. In most cases, it directs ADE to do something, State Board of Education, some county SUPs, even DPS, and then it regulates student tuition organizations and empowerment savings accounts. Rarely does it require a district to do something. So that's another reason why we're not going to have a lot of policy language for you. But and we're still sorting out what we will be changing based on the legislation that was passed. But again, based on what's chaptered, it's very little, and it's almost not even worth mentioning at this point. However, there are a few things that we're working on based on things that have been happening, and I want to mention those. The first thing is we've gotten questions about policy JLCC, which has to do with infectious diseases, and the issue is lice infestation. I know that's a kind of a gross topic to think about, but right now our policy requires that a student must be symptom-free in order to return to school after a lice infestation. We've been informed that that's probably not the right way to approach it, and that we ought to be looking at one that allows us to, gives us the authority to not have that student back, but doesn't necessarily make a hard and fast rule, because it may be being treated, and essentially that student is safe to come back, but is technically speaking not symptom-free. So we're going to be looking at a change to that policy. In addition, we have been notified by a couple of our school attorneys who have been working with the Office of Civil Rights within the U.S. Department of Education on a number of complaints that have happened around the state regarding student-to-student harassment or bullying based on disability. And so OCR is recommending changes to those districts' policies to make it more specific that any harassment or bullying based on disability will not be tolerated, and wanting to beef up the policies in that area. We've always said, harassment, even if it's based on bullying or based on disability or some other factor, is, in almost every instance, harassment anyway. But nevertheless, OCR has made this demand of a number of our districts. We know it's coming around the rest of your districts, so we're going to try to stay ahead of the curve and make a few tweaks to our policy to reflect what's been happening out there. And then finally, I would mention that there's another optional policy that we're working on. There's for meals that are provided under the free and reduced, or the school lunch program, that are provided when school is not in session. There's some new eligibility requirements that are being used by the federal government that allow you to forego the paper application process that you normally have to do under the school lunch program, and actually use data that's been obtained through the SNAP and TANF programs that allow you to become eligible for these programs. And so we're working on an optional policy. It's not something you have to do, but we've had a number of districts that have asked for that, so we're working on that as well. And I would lastly just say one thing, which is that we are very glad that we don't have a lot of policies to write this year, because we're in the middle of converting our policies from the traditional model that you've seen with your documents online, but essentially you need a number of programs to use those documents, to a cloud-based system which does all of our language in HTML, and we're converting districts over to that system. So not having a lot of policy advisories with some folks on one system and some folks on another system is actually a very good thing for us in that regard as well. So having said that, I've used up my time, and thank you for listening, and we'll get to your questions.
Okay, the people know the questions that you submitted. One was a pretty detailed question about district-sponsored charter schools and counting students for the first year. So rather than try and answer that, now if you just want to give me a call, I can go over what Lyle Friesen has kind of said. The next question, and this is a good thing we have Chris here, it says, could you please provide an update as to the status of the class action lawsuit regarding the back payment of base level inflation?
Okay, well, yes, there is an oral argument that will be held on May 9th in Maricopa County Superior Court, because essentially what has happened is we won at the Supreme Court level, and we did receive inflation, I think, this year for a great degree because of the success of that lawsuit. But now it's gone back to the trial court level, where we're going to determine what the state's obligations are. Two issues at hand is, one is what is the base level that needs to be adjusted. is it the level that it was last year, or is it the level that it should have been had those adjustments been made? Our position is the latter. The second issue is that back pay issue of the monies that were not provided during those years, and that will be discussed as well at those proceedings. Hopefully we will have something to tell you soon. I would not be planning on receiving money from the back pay issue, but hopefully within some period of time we will be having some good news on the base level adjustment, because we think we have a better legal argument.
Okay, the next question is, when will the state release the funds for the student success funding? And since Janice knows about walking school buses, she would probably be able to answer that question. I don't think we know. I think it's going to be quite a ways into the school year, because it's just a lot of information they have to gather and put together for this first year. So we will, in fact, at our ASBO meeting on May 14th, we're going to have Dale Frost there, and that's one of the questions that we will ask him. But I do think it's going to be quite a ways into the school year before they'll have the information and can start distributing that money. Then the next question is, will the School Facilities Board inspect school district buildings that have been renovated when updating the age of the buildings? The discussions we had during the legislative session, I think that the director of the SFB was saying that he was not going to inspect school buildings. So I would think he would make those adjustments. And there's a formula in 1102 that talks about how they make adjustments to the age of the building based upon the improvements that were made. But it's hard to speak for somebody else, but I know they talked a couple of times that they didn't have the staff and the resources to actually do the inspections of school buildings.
Yeah, and that was one of those items that there was some disagreement between the education community and the School Facilities Board, where, like Chuck said, the School Facilities Board has said they don't have the staff to do this, but we still believe that's their requirement, and they thought it was the school district's requirement to do so and then update the School Facilities Board, which we don't think statute requires. And it makes it even all the more difficult now that the building renewal formula has been removed from statute, because, I would say the best case on this is that Chuck, about a month ago, we partnered, ASBO and the School Boards Association had sent out to every school district about what needs you're currently what current capital needs you have within your district, both as it relates to renovation as well as the age of buildings and those items. And that's really the information that we're trying to compile in order to make the case both to the legislature about the need for these funds, but also, if the legislature is not compliant, to take the litigation route again to put pressure that way. So I would say, if you haven't filled that, take a look. Everyone received that about a month ago, and I know Tim Hogan is probably starting to make some calls about ways to push that forward.
What a district might say is, well, I'll give you the reports that I'm required to submit when you send an inspector out there. That's just a joke. Does the classroom site fund of $295 include an inflation factor? The classroom site fund is distributed based upon the amount of money that's collected in the sales tax and from the state trust fund, so it doesn't have an inflation. Hopefully it would grow with inflation as the economy grows, but it doesn't have an inflation factor. It's based upon the cash that actually gets collected and then is distributed. The next question, is there any information on how the $500,000 JTED performance funding will be allocated and how it will be paid to JTEDs? I don't have any information on that. There wasn't a lot of discussion in the legislative process on how that would be distributed, so we'll have to see if we can find anybody who might have more information on that. At one time they were talking about it being tied to students who graduate or who were placed in jobs that were consistent with their training, but that was just a brief statement that I heard one time. Next one was Senate Bill 1350 signed by the governor.
Yes.
Yes. And the next one, are there any strings attached to the Student Success Fund? Our understanding is no. When you talk to Dale Frost, they just said your money, you're going to get those dollars and you can spend them as you feel is needed in your district.
And Chuck's absolutely right. I would just keep the caveat of the fact that it is requiring every district to report separately on those expenditures by October 15th of 2015. So like Chuck said, I think the governor's been very, very clear about wanting to provide unencumbered, no strings attached type monies. Having said that, they're still going to be looking at where those expenditures go.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but also on that one, because it's not formula driven and it's going to have to be appropriated, one bad thing to do would be to put it on your salary schedule. You don't know if that's going to actually materialize every year.
Right. At this moment in time, I would consider it a one-time fund, one-time expenditure. We're going to have a new governor, and like Chris said, it would require an ongoing appropriation, which is not there. It's a one-time appropriation.
The next question, does the slide on K-12 finance amounts only include M&O funds? No, it includes all funds. It includes M&O funds, it includes capital funds, it includes all local and all. That's the total amount of revenue that would be available. And if you look at the superintendent's annual report, it's pretty close to $8,800 per pupil if you add up everything. So it's everything included. And we did that intentionally so that somebody doesn't, a lot of times we just look at the rankings, which happens by a lot of the 8 people who do it across the country. They just look at M&O funds because it's a little difficult on capital funds. But anyway, that includes all capital, all operational funds, and all state, federal, and local funds. Okay, did I miss the instructional improvement fund estimate for 2015 compared to this year? It's I don't think we did include it on the slide, but it's $295 is the estimate for next year, and $310 is the oh, no, I'm sorry, the instructional improvement. No, we did not provide any information on instructional improvement, which is the Indian gaming. It's been right around $40 and close to that for the last couple of years. It's hard to do now because the Department of Ed doesn't distribute those monies until late in the year, so we don't have any payments to estimate from. But we'll see if we can find out if someone has done an estimate for this year and for next year.
And correct me if I'm wrong, Chuck, that's a cash-controlled.
That's the instructional improvement fund's a cash-controlled fund.
Right, so there's not going to be a specific estimate. So it's whatever that dollar amount is going to be year to year.
I think what they're talking about is just giving a rough idea of how much money to expect. But we'll see if we can find anything. Why does Senator Biggs quote figures of $17,000 per year per pupil for some districts? There are. If you take some of the really small districts in the state that are exempt from the spending limits, you will have some small districts at 17, 18, 19,000. That's a very, very small percentage of kids in the whole state. When you start looking at the larger school districts, their expenditures aren't anywhere close to that, and they're fairly close. But if you take some really small districts, if you have less than 100 high school students and less than 125, or less than 100 elementary high school students, and less than 125 high school students, you can add to your spending limit whatever you want and pay for it with local dollars. But that's a very, very limited number of districts in the state. And when you look at the number of kids, it's just a very, very, very small percentage. And that is our last question. Janice or Chris, you have any parting remarks?
Thank you. Thank you for participating.
And if anybody has any questions on walking school buses, contact Janice, because she is the state expert on that topic. Thank you very much for attending. We appreciate EJ nicely helping us out today, and we hope you got some good information and enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you for attending.